Pol Pot ruled Cambodia for less than 4 years, from 1975 to 1979. In that short period, between 750,000 and 2 million Cambodians died, most from overwork, starvation, or disease. Some were simply murdered, many with their heads smashed in to save on bullets. It's a staggering figure in a country that had a population of less than 8 million, and a damning indictment of Pol Pot's attempts to rebuild the country from year zero. Almost 30 years later, as the first trials of senior figures in Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge get underway,
the Cambodian people have waited a long time for this process to get.
It seems inconceivable that anyone would defend the movement's genocidal leader. But for many of those that met him, he remains a hero.
Firstly, he is a patriot. Even though he commit, some say a massacre, some say genocide, but still he continued to lead a struggle against foreign occupation for years. He's not a normal person.
I
loved him from when I first met him until now. I didn't see any change in him until his last breath. He always loved the country.
The long road to such adulation and a reputation as one of the 20th century's most brutal rulers began in this small village in central Cambodia. Here, Pol Pot, then known by his real name of Soloth Saw, was born in 1925 in a house on this site. He grew up in a relatively prosperous farming family. The last of his 6 brothers and sisters still lives just a few yards away.
It was quite usual when we were young that we played together and swam together. When he was young, when he went away to study, he was a very nice boy. He never got into trouble with his friends or members of the family.
The country was a French protectorate, nominally ruled by a king, but in reality, all the important decisions were made by the French. Most Cambodians lived in poverty in the countryside, compelled to carry out forced labor for a set number of days every month. But except in times of very exceptional famine, there was enough to eat. Saw made his first steps into this wider world in 1934, when he was sent to the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh, to study. He was a mediocre student, but the family had royal connections, smoothing his path into elite schools that few Cambodians could even dream about entering. It also meant he had access to the royal palace. And for one senior Khmer Rouge official at least, the royal household played an important role in moulding Pol Pot's character.
He used to live in the royal palace. He had a sister and a cousin who used to be concubines of King Monivong, so he learned how to hide his feelings. He saw that there were people who smile in front and stab each other in the back at the palace.
After leaving school, Saw won a scholarship to Paris to study radio engineering. And it was here in the intellectual ferment of the French capital that his political education began. He became progressively radicalized, ending as a firm Stalinist. Having failed his exams, he returned to Cambodia to work as a teacher. His family saw little alteration in him.
He had not changed his attitude when he came back. It was just normal. Whatever happened to him, I did not know about. He just seemed the same.
But the Cambodia he returned to was changing, and in the same year, 1953, it gained its independence from France under King Sihanouk. The French had tired of fighting insurgents in Cambodia. Among the guerrilla groups were the communists, armed and trained by the much larger and stronger Vietnamese Communist Party. After independence, they lay low. But increasing repression by Sihanouk and his government led to unrest, and the Cambodian radical left took up arms again. During this time, Saw married. His wife, Kiu Ponari, herself an intellectual with similar hardline political views.
គាត់ជាអ្នកគឺថានារីមួយដែល
His first wife was a very strong woman. When her father walked out from her mother, she was responsible for looking after all her brothers and sisters. There were 5 of them. That was a big responsibility. Also, she was the first Cambodian woman to gain the high school leaving certificate.
បានសញ្ញាបត្រដែលបាក់
Saw was leading a double life, teaching by day and working for the beleaguered Communist Party in secret. By now, he was a senior figure, his personal magnetism helping to draw young radicals into the movement.
ខ្ញុំជួបគាត់នៅឆ្នាំ
I met him in 1956.
ពលពតគាត់
Pol Pot was very handsome and courteous. He had charisma and was able to attract people.
But Sihanouk's repression continued, and in 1962, Saw fled to the countryside to join the guerrillas. As Sihanouk's secret police rounded up more and more people, large numbers of young students joined the movement. Many were impressed by the man they met there.
When I met him, I admired him because he was highly educated and he sacrificed everything to lead the country. We took him as our role model.
The initial period in the countryside was a difficult one for the Khmer Rouge. Living in rudimentary conditions, they were heavily dependent on the Vietnamese communists. Friction between the two parties grew, but the time was useful to Pol Pot, giving him the opportunity to come up with a uniquely Cambodian form of communism. It stressed the essential role of the peasantry in the battle against the corruption of the city, and it was obsessed with secrecy. The revolutionary chaos of Mao's China in the 1960s also played a key part in radicalizing Saw. Visits to China in the grip of the Cultural Revolution inspired his utopian ideas and buttressed Pol Pot's conviction that his party could survive without Vietnamese help. Ironically, the Cambodian communists also benefited from massive American bombing aimed at the communist Vietnamese forces hiding in Cambodia. Their houses destroyed and land unusable, tens of thousands of new recruits joined the Khmer Rouge. Though for the party leaders in their jungle hideouts, there was little first-hand experience of the terrifying bombardment.
We had a mobile headquarters, we had schools, a nursery, we grew some rice, some we bought from the people. We got plenty of meat, but the things that were lacking were salt and medicines.
While Saw himself was an avuncular figure, fond of visiting the kitchen and the spicy Cambodian dish sour soup.
Sometimes he came to see us when he got bored and talked to us, and if he wanted to chat, he would, about anything. As cooks, we were very close to him. Sometimes he came to tell us that there were visitors, and sometimes he joked that our food was no good. The atmosphere was just like a family.
But the guerrilla war was to intensify after 1970, when the Prime Minister, Lon Nol, overthrew Sihanouk in a pro-American coup. The right-wing Lon Nol government was a disaster. Its pro-American stance meant the Vietnamese rearmed and trained the Khmer Rouge, while the government had little legitimacy and few sound policies. Its soldiers often had little more than a couple of days' training before being thrown into the front line. And by now, even Sihanouk was allied to the Khmer Rouge, their former enemy visiting the liberated zone under their control. He even met Saw under his new revolutionary nickname of Pol Pot. Though such was the secrecy surrounding the movement that the former king was unaware he was meeting its leader. The Khmer Rouge was by now becoming increasingly radical. Collective farms were imposed on peasants in areas it controlled, by force if necessary, while spies and deserters were shot on the spot. Even the new national anthem, allegedly written by Pol Pot, was startlingly violent. The blood was already flowing in Phnom Penh, the last stronghold of the Lon Nol government. Filled with refugees and surrounded by Khmer Rouge troops, it was repeatedly shelled. Attempts to defend the city became more desperate and more bizarre, including the drawing of a circle of magic protective dust around it. Finally, on April the 17th, 1975, it fell. What its citizens did not know was that under Pol Pot, they had even more horrifying ordeals ahead of them. The fall of Phnom Penh to the Khmer Rouge was met with rejoicing in the streets of the city. But within hours, the mood abruptly changed. The true extremism of Pol Pot's movement was revealed as orders were issued to evacuate the entire city of over 2 million people. Those too ill to move or those unwilling to go were summarily executed. Within weeks, only 10,000 key factory workers, soldiers, and officials remained. The blowing up of the National Bank in the center of Phnom Penh symbolized the regime's contempt for money. It would not be needed in the new utopia. It was part of Pol Pot's radicalism, his desire to build the world's purest form of communism.
He picked the best bits of Chinese communism, the best Vietnamese communist ideas, and a little bit from France. He said that they did not apply communism properly 100%. For one example, he evacuated the people to the rural areas, and two, he eliminated money. That was to avoid corruption.
In this regime, even Pol Pot's family were not spared the evacuation.
Yes, I was shocked and surprised and very angry. We thought that the evacuation of the population was for peace, but instead it led to people being killed.
Not that the family knew who was responsible. Such was the paranoia and secrecy surrounding the regime that it would be years before most Cambodians knew who their rulers were. The government went under the sinister title of Angkar, the organization. Pol Pot himself was equally mysterious, hiding his role and his identity under his new name. Incredibly, it was only by chance and right at the end of the regime that his own brother discovered who was in charge of the government.
We did not know where he had disappeared to. We only heard that the government was led by Pol Pot, and we didn't know who that was until 1979. We were eating in the communal eating room when we saw his picture, and we recognized that it was him.
The evacuated former city dwellers were rapidly put to use, working on agricultural communes. It was a radical experiment in which the country would be purified, starting again from year zero. Not just money and city dwelling were abolished, but also markets, schools, hospitals, religion, and private property. At the heart of everything was rice production and the rural poor.
We believed that development should start in the rural areas because there was a lot of land, millions and millions of hectares, and more than 90% of the manpower was there.
But the methods used were vicious and counterproductive. The first 5-year plan sought to triple rice production without modern tools or methods. Using malnourished slave labor, living in pitiful conditions on massive collective farms, it was a disaster, with many tens of thousands dying of starvation and overwork. Those seen as being disloyal, not hard-working enough, or guilty of such minor offences as hunting rats for food could be taken away and murdered. There's little doubt that the plan, its brutality and its failures owed much to Pol Pot.
He was the leader of the Communist Party. He could issue orders to be obeyed in every aspect of the country: politics, economics, military, culture, foreign affairs, just like in any other communist country.
The mass starvation and economic failures led Pol Pot to one conclusion. Not that his plans didn't work, but that internal enemies must be to blame. A former secondary school in Phnom Penh became the leading centre for purging senior officials. At least 15,000 people were taken here to Tuol Sleng. Fewer than 10 emerged alive. The victims usually had mugshots taken before being tortured and executed. One of the photographers remembers the all-enveloping fear that even favoured cadres like him felt.
The
prisoners rarely came out alive from Tuol Sleng, but even our lives belonged to the organisation as well. We knew what was wrong, what was right, but could not say anything. It was the organisation who made the decisions. It could do anything. There was no freedom at the time, and we had to listen to it.
For the man at the centre of the killings, there was little change from the figure he'd cut 20 years before when impressing youthful students.
He always had the same character. There wasn't much change. He was always strong, stable, calm. I never saw him lose his temper. Even if he wanted to kill someone, he still looked happy.
It was in stark contrast to the behaviour of his wife. She'd shown signs of increasing mental illness since the early 1970s, obsessed with fears that the Vietnamese were trying to kill her. She and her husband now rarely met. But Pol Pot did share one thing with his wife: a hatred of the Vietnamese. Still resentful at having been treated as a junior partner by the Viet Cong, he ordered the army to attack Vietnam. Knowing his troops were completely outnumbered, he declared that as long as each killed 30 Vietnamese soldiers, they would win the war. On Christmas Day 1978, the Vietnamese struck back. Within 2 weeks, the Khmer Rouge regime collapsed. Pol Pot had been in power 3 years, 8 months and 20 days. He'd practically destroyed the country's social and economic fabric and left up to a quarter of the population dead. In later years, Pol Pot, according to one of his private secretaries, expressed few regrets for his part in the destruction of Cambodia, instead blaming the people.
He said that there might be one big mistake that he had made. He relied mostly on the poor peasant. When the poor peasant has some power, military power or political power, they use it in a very, very different way, in a very, very bad way. And that is very, very dangerous. And I remember that he always focused on this point.
But the Vietnamese invasion wasn't the end of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Even while the bones of the killing fields continued to be unearthed in their hundreds of thousands, the politics of the Cold War saved him from retribution. China didn't want its old ally captured and tried. While the Americans saw the Khmer Rouge guerrillas in northern Cambodia as a useful tool to tie the Vietnamese down. For the next 18 years, Pol Pot lived once again in the jungle, his army continuing to fight a determined and brutal war. But the withdrawal of Hanoi's troops in 1989 and the Paris Peace Conference that followed signaled the beginning of the end for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge as a serious political force.
He was too old physically, mentally as well. He cannot be as sharp as before.
Defections accelerated in the 1990s, and even Pol Pot's famed ability to persuade and encourage waned as he became more and more ill. Further infighting saw Pol Pot overreach himself in ordering the killing of a senior official, and he was put under house arrest in 1997. Less than a year later, he was dead, probably of heart disease. mourned by the second wife he'd married in 1986 and his daughter. He was cremated at this forlorn site near the Thai border on a pile of rubbish and car tires. But such is the level of devotion he inspired that for some his death in 1998 is still an occasion for sadness.
I was very sorry I was not next to him, but I knew that this time would come because he was ill and had heart problems. It is the law of nature, we have to accept it.
I feel very sad. I feel very sad.
That's not a sadness shared by many. Even senior figures like brother number 2, Nun Chie, now facing trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, acknowledges mistakes were made. Though characteristically, like Pol Pot himself always did, he denies direct responsibility.
Yes, I do have a lot of remorse and a lot of regret. It should not have happened like this. It was not our intention. We did try very hard, but unfortunately what happened was beyond our control.
In his later years, Pol Pot said his regime had actually left a positive legacy in the many dikes and canals it had built, and had revived national patriotism. But the paddy fields he had made were constructed on the bodies of the Cambodian people, and the patriotism he fostered produced a disastrous war with the national enemy. The truth is, he came closer to destroying his country than anyone else, both economically and spiritually. And the brutal means he used to pursue his hopelessly unrealistic ends mean history will almost certainly label him as both evil and incompetent.